Hi everybody, this is Professor Paul Hicks talking to you philosophy again. So today we're going to talk about Plato's Republic, and in particular we're only going to talk about the very beginning of it and the discussion of justice. What is justice? Is it rational and reasonable to be justice, or is it irrational to be just? Does the just man always profit over the unjust man, or does the unjust person actually profit? Those are going to be topics that we discuss today. Plato, let's get a little bit into Plato. Plato was one of the most influential philosophers to have ever existed. He's probably the most well-read philosopher, one of the most influential philosophers. Plato had a teacher by the name of Socrates, and when you're reading Plato, you need to understand that Socrates is the main character of the dialogues than the way that Plato writes. Socrates actually existed, and we're going to talk about Socrates in some other videos. Socrates was the teacher of Plato, and Socrates would go around the city of Athens and he would challenge people's beliefs, not so much giving any actual philosophy of what is right, but showing really that what people think is right is actually wrong. And so you're going to see this kind of Socratic dialogue in Plato's Republic. So let's go ahead and get into Plato's Republic here real quick. All right, so it is a dialogue, right? And Socrates is walking with Glaucon back to Athens. They were leaving a parade in a suburb of Athens, and one of the other characters, Polemarchus, sees Glaucon and Socrates walking, and he sends his slave up to Socrates to have them wait for him. And they convince Socrates and Glaucon to stay in town and at the home of Polemarchus and attend the festivities that are expected to occur later in that evening. And so they enter the house of Polemarchus and they find his brothers Lysias and Euthydemus and their father Cephalus. There are also some other friends that are in attendance. Okay, so that's the real setting of the beginning of the Republic. All right, so Socrates and Cephalus, they're the older men in the group, and they begin to have a discussion about being happy in old age. Cephalus is clearly the older one here than Socrates, but we really don't know by how much. So Cephalus states that as he gets older, he enjoys philosophical conversations rather than the bodily pleasures. He says that he often meets with men of his own age, but these men he finds are not really truly happy. During these meetings, most of these older men talk about their regrets and how they miss what they call the pleasures of youth. These are described, for example, of drinking parties and having wild sex. Keep in mind, these older men, now their bodies are starting to fall apart, and they didn't have Viagra back then. And so these nights of wild sex are probably in their past. They would describe themselves, these older men, as not living well. They complain about old age. They say old age is miserable. They complain about all the infirmities that they now have to suffer simply for being old. But Cephalus, according to him, these old men, they don't know what the cause of their unhappiness actually is. See, they think that the cause of their unhappiness is their bodies that are falling apart. But if this was true, then Cephalus would also be unhappy too, and yet he's not, right? If what makes you unhappy is your body starting to fall apart, then everybody who is old, whose body's starting to fall apart, is going to be unhappy. But Cephalus says, I'm happy, and I don't see any reason that just because my body is starting to go out on me, that I should be unhappy. In fact, what Cephalus thinks about the several men who would not describe themselves as unhappy, one example is from the poet Sophocles, who asked, how do you feel about love? To which the reply was, hush, if you please. To my great delight, I have escaped from it and feel as if I have escaped from a frantic and savage master. All right, I don't know, what is that, the way you think about love or not? But, according to the older people like Cephalus, you've really escaped this need for love in the same way that you have when you were younger, right? You're not always chasing sex anymore. You're not out chasing, sexual partners or anything of that sort. And when you're younger, you're really kind of controlled a lot by your hormones, right? So if you say, you're really controlled by needing to find partners and find sex. You get a relief from that. Cephalus talks about it as a relief, like, wow, I don't have to do this anymore. I'm not controlled by my hormones. I'm not controlled by these types of passions. Old age, he says, brings freedom. Cephalus states, quote, it's like being delivered from a multitude of furious masters. Cephalus argues that the complaints of most old men and their unhappiness isn't really caused by their bodies, but rather it's caused by poor character. He says if they possessed a well-regulated soul and easy tempers, old age itself is no intolerable burden. If they are differently constituted, however, in that case, they find youth as irksome to them as old age. And so it has nothing to do with the body's falling apart. It has to do with what type of character you have, what type of outlook on life do you have. Right? Happiness doesn't derive out of the physical body, but out of something greater and something more. This is going to be important towards the end of our talk today about the nature of justice. Now, some people, Socrates pushes back on Cephalus and says, Cephalus, maybe it's not your character that's allowing you to be happy, but you have a lot of wealth. You're a rich man. And so we can maybe say the reason you're happy is because you're rich, and the rich have many consolations. Cephalus does reply to this objection. He says that is true. It's not completely true, however, because a good man cannot altogether be cheerful with old age and poverty combined. So on the other, no wealth can ever make a bad man be at peace with himself. So Socrates asks Cephalus, where did you get your wealth? Because according to Socrates, Cephalus doesn't seem very fond of money. And Cephalus replies that, well, he inherited some of the money, and then he used it and invested it and made money, right? But he lost some and made some, but for the most part, he got it from inheritance. And he says, why do you ask? And then Socrates states that those who had nothing but made their wealth seem to be disagreeable companions because they will praise nothing but riches. They're like fathers who prefer their own children or poets who love their own work best. Right? So the idea is that if you were poor and you worked your entire life to become wealthy, and you actually become wealthy, according to Socrates, all you end up doing is bragging about your wealth. You have this love of money, and that's not really in accordance with good character for Socrates. So Socrates then asks, what is the greatest advantage of your wealth? And the Cephalus says, it's not really what you think. Since he's old now, he says, I ponder the myths that have been told all my life. So for example, when you think about getting older, you may be into philosophy and you may want to say, well, we don't really know if God exists. We don't know if there's an afterlife. Maybe there is a heaven. Maybe there's a hell. And philosophically, you might be able to dismiss this. But when you're actually getting old and facing death, these questions start to become really important, right? And so for Cephalus, he's asking, is there really a Hades? Is there really an afterlife? If I was a horrible person, am I going to be punished? And so what has wealth brought me? He says people who are wealthy, they don't have to screw other people over, right? When you're trying to climb up the corporate ladder, you're constantly stabbing people in the back. But because Cephalus was born wealthy, he didn't have to climb the corporate ladder, right? And he could be a good person. He didn't have to worry about harming other people in order to get by or harming other people in order to get money because he already had it, right? He says if you review your life and find a life full of unjust deeds, you're likely to have nightmares and be haunted by some sort of gloomy anticipations of the afterlife. But if you review your life and find that you have no unjust deeds, sweet hope is always present. To be able to look back at your life and know that you did not harm anybody is what makes riches valuable, he says. Not for everybody, but for the decent and orderly person. Wealth is about not having to have cheated anybody, not having to have lied to anybody. He says, quote, not to have cheated or lied to anyone against one's will, not to leave for the other world in fearing, owing sacrifices to a god or money to a man. To this, wealth contributes a great deal. All right, so think about that for a bit and whether you believe that's actually true. So, according to Cephalus, what money really allows you, a rich person, to do is to be a just person, right? And when you're poor, you're always having to fight for everything you get, and you end up having to do unjust things to other people. But when you're wealthy, you can simply be a just person, and you don't have to worry about that. And so Socrates says, well, Cephalus, if you understand justice, then you must know what justice is. And Socrates says, can you please tell me? I would love to know what justice is. And so Cephalus comes up with the definition of justice, where he says, quote, justice is defined as telling the truth and giving back what one has taken from another. All right, so justice, according to Cephalus, is defined as telling the truth and giving back what one has taken from another. Now, of course, Socrates is not really happy with this definition, and he comes up with a dilemma here to prove why this particular definition is not going to work. He says, what about saying if you have a mad friend? So, according to Cephalus, you're required to give back what you have taken from another. Well, let's say a friend of yours asks you to store weapons. And they say, I don't need these right now, can you just store them? The just thing, according to Cephalus, would be that when this friend of yours comes back to get their weapons, you would give them to him. Okay, but what about if when your friend comes back to get his weapons, he's yelling and screaming about how he wants to kill somebody and how he's angry that he wants to go out and kill people? Should you give the weapons back to somebody in that state of mind? Would the just act be to give those weapons back? Because if Cephalus is correct and telling the truth and giving back what one has taken from another is the nature of justice, then it seems that the just person would actually have to give weapons back to the friend, even though they know they're going to do very much unjust acts with it. So Cephalus agrees and says, okay, well, you're right, Socrates, this definition is not very successful. But he says, you know what, I can't sit here and deal with this. What I'm going to do is I have to leave. I'm going to give this conversation and my position over to my son, Polemarchus. And so Cephalus leaves and Polemarchus takes it over. Now Polemarchus says, okay, let's go ahead and tweak this just a little bit and redefine justice. And so now Polemarchus says, justice is to restore to each man what is his due. However, he adds a caveat and says that what is due to a friend then is to do good to one another and not harm. So since giving the weapons to the mad friend would actually be injurious, that would not be required by justice, because you're not doing good to your friend, you're going to do something which will ultimately harm your friend. So Socrates, of course, finds a problem with this, because if justice is to give to each man what is due, then aren't we supposed to harm our enemies? And of course, Polemarchus agrees, but of course, Socrates has a problem with this. So let's ask what is actually due to somebody, right? If we're supposed to give what is due to the good people and our friends and give what is due to the bad people, our enemies, let's talk a little bit about that. So what is it that is due? So in order to understand what is due, you need to understand, one, what is the art of an action? Two, what is rendered? And three, who is the recipient? So Socrates gives examples of this. He says, look at the art of medicine. Bodies are the recipients, and drugs, meats, and drinks are the things rendered. Or the art of cooking. Dishes are the recipient, and seasoning are the things rendered. But what is it about the art of justice? Who or what is the recipient, and what is the thing to be rendered? And so they have this conversation about it, and it's agreed then that justice means doing good to our friends and harm to our enemies. But what is the usefulness of justice? See, with this understanding of justice, a physician is the most just with reference to health and disease, or a sea captain or pilot is the most just with reference to the perils of the sea. But what if you're not sick or not at sea? Is there no justice? Right? See, for Socrates and for the ancients, they thought justice was omnipresent. It was always there. But if you're not sick, and what it means to be just for the physician is to heal the sick, then there's no justice at the moment when you're not sick, and this seems to be a problem. He says the sea captain is useless to a person on shore, and a physician is useless to a healthy person. So Socrates then asks, is a just man useless to a person not at war? Right? Because it's important, because if justice is doing good to our friends and harm to our enemies, if we are not at war, who are our enemies? How can we even be just people? If we don't have enemies and we're not at war, then I can't be a just person. Polemarchus wants to argue that justice is still applicable in times of peace because he says we have contracts, right? By contracts, he means there's just these partnerships between two people. And so we give an example of checkers. The just man is the one in which the partner is good and useful in playing checkers. And Polemarchus wants to limit justice now to a sort of money relationship. So, for example, think about a money partnership. If I give you money to hold for me, in other words, I don't need the money right now, you're being just to me if you hold the money for me, you don't spend it, and just give it back to me when I need it. So once again, the problem with this is justice is only useful when I don't need something. Justice is useless when a thing is in use, but useful when it is out of use. But see, if this were true, justice would not be a valuable thing because it can only be applied to things that are useless. And yet justice is a valuable thing, according to Socrates, if not the most valuable thing. So the just man is the one who can perform his art best, according to Socrates. But then this leads to a contradiction. So think of it this way. Imagine if you were a security guard. Well, who's going to be the best security guard? Well, that's going to be the person who is best at guarding, correct? So, but if you are the best at guarding, then you know how it is that people steal. And so in order to understand how people steal, in order to be the best at guarding, you have to understand how people steal, and you have to understand how thieves work. So to be the best guard, you necessarily also have to be the best thief. And therefore, in this instance, the just man is the one who can both steal and guard well. And that's a contradiction, and we can't have that according to Socrates. So he says, imagine the most perfectly just man, he must also be the most unjust man at the same time. But this, Socrates says, that can't be true because a perfectly just man cannot have any injustice in his nature at all, by the definition of being perfectly just. So another reason why justice cannot be to do good to friends and harm to our enemies is because how do we know who is the friend and who is the enemy? Haven't we ever been wrong about something like that? We can't just say who acts nice to us as our friends and who acts wicked to us as our enemy, because we make mistakes. He says, imagine being wrong about who is a friend or not, and then the just man would therefore do harm to somebody who's a friend and good to somebody who's an enemy. But this is a contradiction again, because Polemarchus has already said that one is only just when they do good to their friends and harm to their enemies. All right, so then they change the definition of justice a little bit more, and they say justice is now do good to our friend if he really is a good man and not just appears to be, and to do harm to our enemies when he is really a bad man and not just appears to be. Well, guess what? Socrates has a problem with this definition as well, because he says a just man would never harm anybody. What happens when you harm somebody? Do you make them better off or do you make them worse off? For example, if you were to harm a horse, is the horse going to be a better horse for you, or is it going to be a worse horse? He says, according to Socrates, when something is harmed, it's made worse in virtue of what it is. And so what you would have here, if you're doing harm to your enemies, is you'll have people, a just man would be the one who makes things worse. But this is a problem, right? He says the same must be held for men, that when they are harmed, they're lowered in the scale of virtue or human excellence. But justice is the very type of thing which promotes virtue and promotes excellence. So the just man would be the one who makes men unjust, and this is really silly according to Socrates. So guess what? They agree that Socrates has won the argument and that justice is not giving each man what is due. All right, so let's go ahead and continue with a new definition of justice, and we're going to enter with the character Thrasymachus. So Thrasymachus enters in with a new definition of justice, and his first definition is justice is whatever is in the interest of the strongest. What is in the interest of the stronger? So, of course, Socrates doesn't agree with this. He says there's really different types of rulers. So they discuss tyranny, democracies, aristocracies. So think about what justice would be in a tyranny. If Thrasymachus is right, then justice in the tyranny is going to be what is ever best for the tyrant, right? So the average person should always do what is best for the tyrant if they're going to, in fact, be just. So to argue against this, Socrates establishes a few points. Number one, rulers can make mistakes. And two, when they make a mistake, they're actually going against their own interest. So according to Thrasymachus, what is just is to do what is in the interest of the rulers and do what is not in the interest of the rulers. Once again, what do we have here? We have a contradiction. We're having a fallacy of inconsistency here. Of course, Thrasymachus doesn't accept this because he says when a ruler errs, he is not, insofar as he is in the error, the stronger at that precise moment. So for an example, if think about a physician for a moment. When the physician, the art of being a physician is to heal. Well, what happens if the physician makes a mistake and they think they're healing, but they're not actually healing? Then at that precise moment, they're not practicing the art of being a physician. They're not being a physician at the very moment that they're actually doing harm, right? When they're mistaken about this. They're not healing the sick at that moment. And Thrasymachus says the same can be said about the stronger. When they're in error, they're not at that precise moment the stronger. Well, Socrates replies that under this type of strict definition, it cannot be the case that the rulers are truly the rulers when they act for their own interest over the interest of the ruled. So, why? Well, we've already established that a physician is only a physician when he heals the sick and only when he heals the sick. When they are in error, they're not healing the sick and are therefore not a physician. So although it might seem that the physician has other interests, so for example, making money, right? But in fact, when that is the focus, he's not practicing the craft of healing. Rather, he's practicing the art of making money. So when you focus on making money, if the physicians only do this to make money, they're not really being a physician, they're being a money maker, right? So when he loses focus from healing towards other interests, he ceases to be a healer, right? A physician does what is good for the body, not for the art of healing. A horseman does not what is good for horsemanship, but what is good for horses. A pilot is a commander of sailors and not a sailor himself. Therefore, if a ruler is ruling towards his interest, he immediately ceases to be a ruler. A ruler is only a ruler when they exercise the craft of ruling. And ruling is by definition, it's analytic, they would say, that doing what is good for the ruled and not the ruler. Therefore, according to Socrates, it is impossible for the ruler to do what is in his interest, because once he does this, he ceases to be a ruler at all. Well, guess what? Thrasymachus says, hey, Socrates, you got me all wrong here. Socrates thinks that to be a ruler, one must imagine that they are concerned with their subjects rather than themselves. And Thrasymachus says, well, this would be akin to saying that a shepherd is only concerned with the good of his sheep rather than himself. But that's a rather odd thing to say, because a shepherd fattens his sheep and takes care of them, not so that the sheep may benefit, but so that he may benefit. And the same is true with the ruler. He doesn't care about the subjects, but only his own advantage. The rulers are unjust and the subjects are just. So furthermore, Thrasymachus argues it is more profitable to be unjust than it is to be just. And this is going to be the next question that we're going to talk about. Is it, set aside for just a moment what justice is, right? Because that's obviously an important question, but a very difficult one to answer. Should you be just, right? Do you benefit by being a just person? Or does the unjust person benefit more? So, for example, if you're dealing with the city and, say, paying property tax, the person who is perfectly just will always pay the right amount of tax. But think about somebody who's perfectly unjust. They're going to try to cheat on their taxes, right? Now, it might seem that the unjust person gets away with cheating on their taxes and therefore they profited by being unjust, and the just man who had to pay his fair share of taxes actually lost money, and therefore the unjust man seems to have profited more in this instance than the just man, right? The unjust man has a different experience than the just man. That is, they can offer special favors to friends, thereby they can have more friends, they can spend money on themselves rather than a community, because this is what's profitable for them. And according to Thrasymachus, it is always more profitable to be unjust than it is to be just. So think of the most unjust form of government you can. That is a tyranny. The tyrant is the one who has the greatest profit, and anybody who goes against the tyrant will suffer greatly. But of course, the tyrant can do whatever they want, and they will profit. And the more of a tyrant that person is, the better off they are, right? The stronger they are, the more of a tyrant they are, the more they're able to get for themselves, and the more that they're able to profit. He can enslave any of the citizens. The tyrant can take any property that he wants. People will actually call him happy, highly favored, not only by the men of his own city, but of anybody that hears of his comprehensive injustice. Thrasymachus says people do not abuse injustice because they are afraid of committing it, but they are afraid of suffering from it. The one who commits injustices are the ones who have power, money, and happiness. Therefore, according to Thrasymachus, injustice is a stronger, a freer, and a more lordly thing than justice, a thing profitable and advantageous to oneself. All right, so what do you think Socrates' position is on this? Clearly he's going to disagree, right? So he disagrees with Thrasymachus, and he says that the life of the unjust man is never more profitable than the just man. All right. So let's go and think about the rulers being unjust and the subjects just. All right, so let's think about this for a bit. Think about going back to the shepherd if we can, right? Socrates responds and he says, it's not sticking to the strict definition of a ruler or a shepherd. So think of a shepherd again. A shepherd is strictly speaking one who guards over the flock. Just because they also have an eye for feasting on the flock when they're all fattened up later, does not mean that the art of being a shepherd is to feast on the flock. Similarly, the art of the physician is to heal the sick. Even though a doctor might make money, the art of being a physician, we would never say is to make money. What it means to be a physician is to heal the sick. Is it possible that you can be a physician and not make any money at all? Well, of course it is. You absolutely can do that. And so what it is to be a physician has nothing to do with making money. Making money is on the side of that. And the same is true about the shepherd. Feasting on the flock later is not what it is to be a shepherd. To be a shepherd is to be concerned with the health of the flock and to take care of the flock. All right, so according to Socrates, a ruler is in the same situation. A ruler is not a good ruler when they take care of themselves. A ruler is a good ruler when they focus on their subjects, if they're in fact, strictly speaking, being a ruler. It may be the case that, of course, they profit materially by being a ruler, but that has nothing to do with the art of ruling itself. For once again, one can be a leader, one can be a ruler without actual profit. And so there's no analytic sense where in order to be a ruler, one must profit. All right. So, are the rulers, as to the rulers being unjust and the subjects just, Socrates argues that to truly be a ruler, then you must provide for the subject for whom you rule. This requires looking out for the interests of the weaker, not the stronger. And so when Thrasymachus talks about justice being the interest of the stronger, the justice is whatever the ruler decides, and what is in the best interest of the ruler. Socrates says that's not what it is to rule. To rule is to look after what's in the best interest of those that you are ruling, the best interest of the subjects themselves. Right? Socrates then wants to go after Thrasymachus's position that perfect injustice is somehow more profitable than perfect justice. He says when we are unjust to people, what happens? They are unjust to us. And so what happens is that injustice actually brings about more injustice. So eventually those whom we associate with will be unjust back to us since we've been unjust to them. And then what's going to happen? I'm going to be unjust to them, again, because they were unjust to me. Now I was unjust to them, and so they're going to want to be unjust to me. And so now we fall into this cycle of injustice breeds more injustice, breeds more injustice, breeds more injustice. If we want others to be just to us, then what do we have to do? We have to be just to them. All right. So Thrasymachus ultimately just kind of gives up on defining this. He's like, oh, Socrates, whatever, you and your philosophy. And he ends up leaving. Well, opening up now Book 2 of the Republic, Glaucon wants to take up the argument from Thrasymachus. He says, I'm not going to agree with Thrasymachus. He says, but just for the sake of argument, let's go ahead and talk about whether or not the just man profits more than the unjust man. Right? Well, Socrates wants to start this off, and he says, look, there are three classes of good things. One, these are things that we value for their own sake. These are things like happiness or pleasure. Two, things we value both for their own sake and for the results. We value, say, intelligence, eyesight, health. Then also things we value not for themselves, but rather for their consequences. Exercise, medical treatment, working, listening to a philosophy lecture, studying, trying to get an A on your reading questions so you can get an A into class. So, so Glaucon is now going to, of course, argue on behalf of Thrasymachus, and he says that justice is not valued for itself, and injustice is better than justice. Two, that those who practice it do so against their own will, and three, that they act reasonably in doing so. All right. So Glaucon argues that while it may sound nice that justice is more profitable for the soul, it isn't really. And deep down, we all know that this is the case, he says. He shows this by talking about the ring of Gyges. Let's see if this particular story sounds familiar to you. Imagine that one day an earthquake occurred and a huge chasm opened up where a shepherd was herding his sheep, and he climbs into this big chasm where the earth split, and he finds a ring. Now he puts the ring on, and he turns the ring, and he becomes invisible. So now we have this magical ring where if you turn it, you become invisible. What would happen if a perfectly just man had that ring versus a perfectly unjust man who had that ring? Right? Nobody, right? Imagine if you had this ring. He said nobody would be able to withstand temptation to set aside justice and never use the ring unjustly. If you really had that, I mean, you ask yourself this. I'm assuming that you're probably decent people, and that for the most part you act, I would say, probably in a just way, I would hope. But imagine if you had this ring. You could get away with all sorts of stuff. What types of things would you do? right? You could go into a store and you can steal something and nobody would ever know. He says you can go and kill and release anybody from prison that you might want. You could go into private houses and have intercourse with whomever you wanted. That one's always seemed a little strange to me because if the idea that you can have sex with somebody and they wouldn't know that you're having sex with them, that seems kind of weird. I don't think you're doing it right, Socrates, if that's the case. But think about this, right? This person who has this ring, they would be a god among men. Everybody, even those who are perfectly just, would eventually choose to do some unjust action if they have this new ability. So imagine somebody actually has this ability to where they can turn the ring and make themselves invisible. What would we think about somebody who had that ability but never used it? Would you think that they were irrational? Would you think that they're some sort of pitiful creature? I mean, we would all sing his praises in public and would say, oh, he's such a good person for being perfectly just. But what would you think in secret? In secret, Glaucon thinks we're going to think of them as being foolish. That you had this opportunity to get what you wanted, to be happy, and you blew it. So that would be rather irrational and foolish according to Glaucon. So what reason would a man have for being just if there were no consequences if he were unjust? Well, that's not a very easy question to answer. And he spends a lot of the rest of the Republic trying to answer that. Not so much strictly speaking on what the just soul is, but rather he's going to say on the just state. And so what Socrates says is that, say, look, if you want to know what justice is, let's blow it up on a bigger scale. Rather than trying to find what makes one individual just, what would an entire state be? An entire city? What would a just city be? A just state be? And if you can look at it on a large scale, and because Plato believed in forms, if you remember this, then if you can understand the form on a large scale, you'll understand the form on the small scale. And so much of the rest of the Republic is the political philosophy of Plato. We're not going to really get into that, but let me just give you a little answer, I think, where ultimately Socrates is going to go. Socrates and the Greeks believed in a concept called eudaimonia. Now, eudaimonia translates to happiness, but that's not the type of, it wasn't like happiness of the flesh or anything like that. It's a type of happiness which is created after a life well lived. It is a sort of like really deep-seated happiness of being at peace with oneself, to have lived a life well. This is what's important. And according to Plato, in order to do this, you need to have lived your life well. You need to be just. All right? Go back to Cephalus there at the beginning of the Republic. Right? He says, in order to be happy, one must have good character. It's not about being old and what that makes you unhappy. It's about having good character. And so ultimately for Plato, having good character is important to being happiness. And so that the just person will reach eudaimonia, but the unjust person would not. And to reach eudaimonia is what we're actually after. And in order to do that, you have to have good character and have a well-ordered soul. I would really strongly encourage you to read the rest of the Republic. It's a really, really great piece of political philosophy, and it's beautiful. So I really hope that you will, maybe take the time to read the rest of it. But that's all we're going to talk about for now. Just book 1, book 2 just gives you an idea of what philosophers are attempting to do when we try to define a term such as justice. All right. So I hope this video helped you out. We'll go ahead. That's book 1 and book 2 of the Republic. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me, and I look forward to talking to you. Have a good day, guys.